The summer of 1944 pressed down on the flatlands of southeast Arkansas like a heavy lid. For most people out here, the war was just a string of names drifting out of the radio: Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Saipan, Tarawa. For Koichi Miura, those names still carried the smell of damp canvas, mildew, and gunpowder. They weren't dots on a map. They were places that lived in his lungs. The last stretch of ocean he remembered was in the winter of 1943. He'd been a naval corporal on a small transport headed toward Rabaul. One night, American carrier planes came screaming out of the clouds. No warning, no prelude, just sudden metal wings slicing through the dark. A single dull thud tore the ship open. He remembered being thrown across the deck, the roar of the blast, the ship's bones cracking, and then the violent rush of seawater pouring into the torn hull. When he woke again, the ship was gone. He was face down in a life raft, surrounded by driftwood, oil slicks, and a few bodies floating belly up, faces turned to the sky. His rescuers were the enemy. He didn't know yet that the Americans would ship him out of the Pacific, across an entire continent, and drop him in a place called Arkansas. The truck from the main POW camp to the farm detachment rattled like it was held together by habit. Koichi sat hunched, wrists and ankles chained to the men beside him. The rear doors were shut. Only a thin slit near the roof let in a strip of white light that cut across the faded uniforms. The sun turned the cloth pale, the once proud imperial insignia worn down to smudged shadows. Outside, the sounds were wrong. No harbor cranes, no seabirds, no jungle insects. Instead, slow drawn-out English, twisted with a southern twang. A cow lowing, a tractor coughing somewhere off in the fields. The guards at the POW camp had told them they were headed for farm work. Someone muttered in Japanese, voice dry, "So now imperial soldiers get to grow American crops." It was half a joke, half a cough. Koichi didn't answer. Silence had become his safest uniform. Ever since his capture, he'd learned that words could betray too much. Doubt, longing, the faces of the dead. Silence betrayed nothing. It didn't swear loyalty. It didn't deny it either. The truck lurched to a stop. Chains clinked. Boots thudded on dirt outside. The lock rattled, and the door folded down. Heat and dust hit them at once. American MPs in dark green uniforms stood on either side of the ramp, rifles slung over their shoulders, pistols at their hips. The green of their cloth was deeper than Japanese khaki, and stained darker under the arms and along the spine, where the sweat never quite dried. Koichi squinted against the light. When his eyes cleared, he saw it. Cotton, row after row of cotton, stretching out like a white sea. At the far end of that field stood a 2-story wooden house, its siding bleached and peeling, the grain showing through. In front of the house stood a man in a wide-brimmed straw hat and a sun-faded undershirt. His skin was darkened by years of work, his arms marked with dry, cracked streaks of old mud. He didn't hold himself like a soldier. His posture leaned forward just a bit, the way a man bends toward the ground day after day until his back accepts it. His gaze moved over the faces of the Japanese prisoners, calm, measuring, not hostile, not welcoming, just assessing. Koichi noticed his eyes, pale, touched with gray, like a river under overcast skies. They rested on him for a heartbeat longer than on the others. "Down! Line up!" an MP shouted, tapping the truck bed with his rifle butt. They jumped down, boots sinking slightly into sun-softened dirt. Heat rose off the ground, mingling with the moist smell from the cotton and the sharpness of fertilizer. The prisoners were herded into 2 lines facing the house. The man in the straw hat took off his hat, slapped some dust off on his pant leg, then put it back on. He walked along the line, each step leaving a small puff of dirt. The MP lieutenant beside him spoke in a clipped official tone. "They're from the main POW camp. 8 hours of farm work a day. You pay per head. We handle their treatment under the Geneva Convention." He stressed Geneva Convention just enough that the prisoners would hear it. As if the words themselves were another instrument of American order, Koichi didn't understand the language, but he recognized the confident rhythm of a victor explaining the rules. The farmer, Charles, the lieutenant called him, nodded but said nothing. He seemed uninterested in the convention, in technicalities about treatment. He cared about something simpler, whether these men could work. He had them raise their arms and spread their fingers, turn around, bend over. He tugged at sleeves and collars, checking muscle and bone. One prisoner so thin his uniform hung like cloth on wire made him pause. Charles shook his head and muttered. The lieutenant translated for his own benefit. "Too weak, I need workers, not ghosts." When he came to Koichi, those pale eyes lingered, then dropped to his hands. Calluses across the palms, thick knuckles, little ridges of scar along the nails, years of hauling salt sacks, crates, shells. Charles grabbed his wrist and squeezed his forearm. "Strong," he said flatly. The lieutenant chuckled. "You got one good man, Charles." So that was the farmer's name. Koichi tried it in his head once, Shiruzu, awkward in Japanese, and then pushed it away. Since becoming a prisoner, Names had lost their weight. Corporal Mira didn't fit him anymore. He was just another number on a clipboard. Charles didn't react to the compliment. He grunted, as if someone had just told him the sky was blue, and turned toward the house. Halfway there, he paused, looked back at the line of prisoners and spoke. "Listen, work hard. No trouble. Understand?" The lieutenant translated loosely in Japanese. "Do your work. Don't cause trouble. Got it?" A man in the front row straightened instinctively and shouted back, "Hi." The single syllable was sharp, drilled, a reflex from endless roll calls. Charles frowned at the sound. The word meant nothing to him, but the tone did. He'd heard that tone in newsreels. "They say yes," the lieutenant added with a smirk. Koichi didn't speak. He just gave a small nod. Whatever this place was, it was his world now. He didn't know for how long, or under what terms, the war would end, or whether Niigata still stood. But he understood this much. From now on, his food, his water, his bed, and his breath were tied to this unknown farm in Arkansas. As they were split into work groups, one of the MPs led Koichi's group to the field closest to the farmhouse. As they passed the yard, a smell drifted out from behind the house. Warm, oily, faintly salty. Not the sea, not engine grease, but food. His throat tightened. Since capture, camp food had been enough to keep them upright, but never enough to satisfy. It was bland, stripped down, every grain of salt was counted. The smell thinned in the breeze. Koichi glanced toward the source and saw a half-open back door. A small woman in an apron stepped out, setting a bucket of water down by the step. Her hair was tied back into a loose knot. She glanced quickly at the yard full of unfamiliar Asian faces, her expression neither hostile nor kind, just careful. In that instant, Koichi felt it clearly. He was no longer at the front, no longer at sea, not on an airfield or jungle island. He had been moved to a different theater of war, one where survival depended on weather and crops, not artillery, where the question each day wasn't who advanced and who retreated, but whether there'd be enough harvest to get through winter, and salt still mattered here too. Not as a ration on a manifest, not as a supply item, but as an invisible measure. Who got to decide how much to use? Who got a little more? Who got none? They reached the field. The soil was soft and slightly sticky. Cotton plants brushed against his work pants as he moved. The sun burned the back of his neck. His hand rose by habit toward his chest, searching for the small family crest pendant his father had given him. His fingers met nothing. The pendant was in a tin box back at the main camp, sealed away with dozens of other rings, watches, and keepsakes. The guard said they'd be returned after the war. But after the war meant 100 different futures, and none of them felt real. He lowered his hand and tightened his grip on the hoe. An MP pointed at a row of cotton and said, "Here, work." Koichi bent forward and took his first swing in American soil. By 2 in the afternoon, the shadows in the cotton rows had shrunk almost to nothing. Arkansas heat was not like the humid weight of summer back in Honshu. Here the air felt dry and heavy at the same time, like a layer of dust lining the inside of his nose. The back of Koichi's neck reddened under the sun. Sweat soaked his shirt and ran down into his waistband. He wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist and blinked grit from his eyes. The MP leaned against a post at the edge of the field, lazily fanning himself with his cap, tapping his thigh with the butt of his rifle. The prisoners worked in near silence. The only sounds, the rasp of hose, the rustle of cotton leaves, and the distant cough of a tractor. Koichi had already found a rhythm. 3 swings, 1 breath, 5 steps, turn. The more his body tired, the clearer his mind became, not in the sense of insight, but in the way exhaustion stripped away the present and left room for older memories to seep in. Especially memories of salt. He'd been born in a small village on the coast of Niigata, right next to the salt flats. Bright, harsh, and bitter, that was how he remembered the place. Summer sun beat down on shallow pools of seawater until white crystals formed. Men raked and shoveled and scraped, turning seawater into survival. His father used to say, "Salt keeps you alive. It keeps fish through the winter. It keeps the fever from taking you if you drink it in hot broth." Koichi had grown up with salt dust embedded in his skin. He remembered his father's wide back, the permanent crust of salt on his forearms, his skin rough like sandpaper. The air there was always dry and briny, not like sea wind, but sharper. Fine grains carried by the wind stinging his lips, leaving behind a taste that was half bitter, half necessary. As a child, he'd thought that was simply what the world tasted like. He had never imagined that one day, salt would be the bridge between him and strangers on the other side of the world. At midday, the guards finally called for a break. The prisoners sat against the fence line, backs to the rough wooden planks. Each man was handed a tin cup of water. Only water, no salt. Koichi accepted his with both hands, as if it were part of a ceremony. The water was warm and faintly muddy, but it cooled his dry throat. He'd drunk half when he heard a dull thump up ahead. The youngest man in their group had collapsed, his body folded in on itself as if someone had pulled the bones out from under his skin. Koichi recognized him, a late recruit, barely grown into his uniform, transferred from the main camp just days before. He'd already looked weak that morning. The MP hurried over, frowning. Heat exhaustion, he muttered to himself. Another Japanese prisoner knelt beside the boy and tried to explain in broken English, mixing words and gestures. No salt legs like this. He mimed spasms. The guard didn't understand the words, but he saw the young man's legs twitching uncontrollably and waved the others back. Charles walked over as well, drawn by the commotion. He looked down at the boy with the appraising eye of a man used to sick animals, a mixture of detachment and a practical kind of concern. "He gonna pass out like this every day?" he asked. The MP shrugged. "They don't get much salt at the camp." Charles's frown deepened. He knew exactly what that meant. Workers who collapsed in the field were bad for harvest. He turned toward the house. "Eileen?" The back door opened a moment later. The woman in the apron, Eileen, hurried out, holding a small clay jar. Her steps were quick, but there was a care in them too, like she'd been moving this way her whole life. She popped the lid off. Inside was fine, white salt. Koichi stared. The salt he'd known was coarse, sometimes tinged with gray or yellow, heavy in the palm. This was different, whiter, finer, like snow, shaved from a different sky. Eileen scooped a small spoonful into a cup of water, stirred with her finger until it dissolved, and handed it to the MP. "Let him drink this." The guard propped the boy up and brought the cup to his lips. The prisoner's hands shook, his muscles still jumping under the skin, but he swallowed the salt water in a few gulps. A few minutes later, the spasms started to ease. His breathing settled. Koichi watched the entire time. That was the first true salt he'd seen since stepping onto American soil. Salt that wasn't just the bitter trace left on his own dried sweat. Charles eyed the clay jar, his face hardening. "Don't use too much. Salt's expensive these days." "I know," Eileen replied softly. "But if they don't get any, they'll die." Charles was silent for a moment. His jaw worked, like there was something else he might say, but in the end, he only looked toward the line of prisoners. His pale eyes landed on Koichi's face. Koichi looked away, then forced himself to look back. He knew that to men like Charles, they were enemies. Japs, the faces seen in propaganda reels, men who had fought and killed. But right now, they were also just people whose bodies needed sodium to keep going, whose muscles would cramp and fail without it. When Eileen put the lid back on the jar, her gaze briefly met Koichi's. She held it for a heartbeat, then gave a small, almost invisible nod before turning away. No words passed between them. But for the first time on this foreign land, Koichi felt that someone had looked at him not as an enemy or a number, but as a human being. They were herded back into the fields, the brief rest already fading under the sun. Koichi's hands trembled slightly on the hoe. He couldn't quite say why. Was it the taste of salt still ghosting the air? Eileen's quiet insistence? Charles's tight-lipped, "Don't waste it." In that moment, salt became a line, connecting him to his past, and tying him, whether he liked it or not, to this farm. That evening, as they trudged back toward the camp, Koichi felt something hard in his pocket. He fished it out when the MP wasn't looking. It was a small piece of metal, an old button he must have stepped on in the field, dirt-stained and useless. He turned it between his fingertips for a while. Then later that night, under the cover of routine and the MP's bored gaze, he slipped out for a moment near the back of the farmhouse. Quietly, he placed the button on the back steps by the door where Eileen usually appeared. It was clumsy, inadequate, almost childish, but it was the only way he knew how to say thank you. The next day, Charles noticed the button. He frowned, picked it up, looked at it for a second, and then slipped it into his pocket instead of throwing it away. Koichi never saw that, but he sensed something had shifted. Just a fraction war had brought him here against his will. Yet some things, even something as small as salt, still had the power to draw a thin, almost invisible line between people. Night settled over the barracks without bringing much relief. The air inside was still thick and warm, carrying the mixed smells of sweat, dust, and damp wood. Koichi sat on the edge of his bunk, fingertips tracing the cracks in the board beneath him. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to shut down. The taste of salt water lingered faintly at the back of his tongue. It didn't belong to him. He hadn't drunk that particular cup, but the idea of it clung to him anyway, tangled up with memories of Niigata winters, steaming bowls of soup, his father's tired voice, cold wind blowing off the salt flats. Men murmured in low voices around the barracks. Someone speculated about the war. Someone else placed a quiet wager on who'd be sent to dig ditches the next day. Most kept their thoughts to themselves. Silence had settled over them like an extra layer of skin. Protective, habitual, hard to peel off. Koichi, too, was usually wrapped in that silence. But tonight, it felt thinned, as if the salt water from earlier had seeped into the cracks, loosening something he'd kept tightly packed away. He thought of the boy collapsing in the field, of Eileen running with the clay jar, of Charles's frown and the way he didn't argue further when she said, "Or they'll die." That hadn't been pity, exactly. Pity had a way of looking down. What he'd seen in her face was something quieter, simpler, an instinct to keep another person alive. "Miura," a voice came from the next bunk. An older prisoner, hair shot through with gray, watched him. "You look like you've got something on your mind." Koichi froze for a heartbeat, then shook his head. He'd been taught that prisoners didn't have the right to doubt, to waver, to confess. Whatever stirred in his chest belonged to him alone. Outside, footsteps approached, the slow, heavy tread of an MP on patrol. The barracks fell still. Only the creak of boards and the soft scuff of soles against earth came through the wall. The footsteps passed. Silence rolled back in. Koichi lay back, then sat up again almost immediately, eyes drawn to the dull circle of light cast on the ground outside by the guard's lantern. It wasn't bright. It didn't cut the darkness. It merely held a small patch of night at bay. He realized then that the world, torn and burned and shattered by war, wasn't held together by the blinding glare of heroism. It was held together, if at all, by these small, stubborn points of light. A lantern, a cup of salted water, a knot at the back door. He looked down at his hands. The knuckles were rough, the palms cracked and embedded with the day's dirt. These hands had held rifles, hauled crates, pushed artillery shells into place. At home, they had carried salt sacks, heavy and abrasive. Here, for the first time, they were allowed to be simply hands, tools for work, not sacrifice. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a traitor. He was a man thrown far from home by a war he hadn't started, still breathing when so many others were not. And staying alive, he realized, was its own kind of record. A record that war had failed to turn him into a monster. A record that even on enemy soil, someone would bring water and salt to a collapsing stranger. A record that when the fighting stopped, the world would still need ordinary, scarred men who could walk forward and remember. The thought didn't comfort him, but it steadied him. He found that he was no longer afraid of tomorrow, not because tomorrow held hope, but because it held obligation. As long as he kept waking up, he would be standing in the place of those who no longer could. That he understood suddenly was why he had been left alive. By the spring of 1946, Arkansas had softened. The worst of the heat was months away. The cotton fields had been turned over, the soil dark and moist, flecked with pale traces of last year's crop. Koichi stood at the door of the barracks with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Inside were a worn blanket issued by the Americans, a pair of scuffed shoes, a few unsent letters he'd never dared to put in the mail, and a small bag of salt Charles had pressed into his hand. When the gate in the barbed wire fence swung open, the air felt strangely light. An MP ran a pencil down a list, drew a line through his number, and waved him forward. Dozens of men moved down the narrow path between the fields. Their footsteps were heavy out of habit, but lighter than they had been in years. The camp was closing. The war, at least in this corner of the world, was over. Charles stood by the edge of the field, not close enough to call it a farewell, but not far enough to pretend he wasn't there. His expression was as severe as ever, the same look he used when sizing up a row of crops, but something in his eyes had shifted, just enough that Koichi could feel it. Koichi stopped for a moment and bowed slightly from the waist. The gesture was small, but it held all the words he didn't have. Charles watched him, then raised his chin in a brief, rough nod. From the back door of the house, Eileen appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. She hesitated, then lifted one hand and gave him a small wave, more of a sketch in the air than a full gesture. It was enough to tighten something in his chest. He thought of the salt jar, of the boy in the field, of the button on the step, of the smell of bread and frying oil drifting out of her kitchen. Small things, all of them, but in the long dark of those years, they had felt like points of light. The line moved on. Sandaled feet and worn boots pressed a thin track into the earth just outside the fence. Koichi didn't look back again, but he knew the memory of this place would return to him unannounced in years to come. Cotton fields under a flat white sun, a dim lantern outside a barracks, a kitchen where salt was rationed carefully, but never entirely withheld. His fingers tightened around the little bag of salt in his pack. It weighed almost nothing, but it anchored him. It wasn't a gift in the ordinary sense. It wasn't a souvenir to be shown off. It was a reminder that no matter what the war had taken, countries, ships, cities, people, there were still small, stubborn things he could hold on to. The taste of salt, the memory of a stranger's quiet kindness, the fact that he was still walking. The trucks rumbled to life. Dust rose slowly behind them, curling into the air. Koichi understood then that his purpose wasn't to prove anything, to anyone, to any nation, to history. His purpose was simpler and heavier, to keep going, to carry back the taste of salt, to carry back the experience of having survived in a place designed to be temporary, to carry, in his ordinary body, the tomorrows that dead men would never see. The journey home would be long. What waited there? Ruins or houses, family or absence, he did not know. The future did not glow. It barely flickered, but the ground beneath his feet continued, one step after another. As long as that ground stretched ahead, his value lay in this, that he was still on it, still moving, still witness, and somewhere in his pack, a small bag of salt shifted with the motion of the truck, as if to agree.